So welcome to this next recorded webinar that walks through for you guys different SEFEL pyramid model fidelity measures. My name is Kate Wasserman, and with me is Margot Candelaria. We are the co-directors of the Parent, Infant, and Early Childhood Program at the University of Maryland School of Social Work.
So the objectives for this webinar are to support you guys as learners in understanding what the benchmarks of quality are for the pyramid model implementation in your various settings. We hope to support the learners and your appreciation of the need for using database decision making in the pyramid model implementation, and also your ability to understand the different components of two different benchmarks of qualities and their questions and how they apply throughout your program's implementation. So just to give you guys some background in case some of you don't know who we are, we work at the School of Social Work at the University of Maryland in Baltimore in the Institute for Innovation and Implementation. And within that group, we run the Parent, Infant, Early Childhood program, which really implements and evaluates several programs and trainings throughout the state, all related to parents, infants, and early childhood. So probably the most relevant to you is our National Pyramid Model SEFEL work throughout the state, which includes a lot of training initiatives within Part C and within the Birth to 5 program.
This is a visual that many of you have seen many times over, but just wanted to give a primer for what we're talking about today. And it's really rooted in this sort of idea of applying a public health or pyramid model approach to all children's social and emotional needs, whether they be in the classroom, in the home, being seen by a pediatrician or an early intervention provider. This idea of it all being grounded in an effective workforce, and what that means is a workforce that's trained to identify and screen and discuss all components related to scaffolding and supporting development for young kids with respect to social and emotional needs, and then moving into what are some universal things that all kids and families need to support and grow those skills. What are some secondary interventions and how do they look different when they're in a classroom or you're coaching a parent to do it directly within the home? And then how do we understand the needs of those top tier kids in the sort of top of the intensive intervention components? And how do we really not just rush to that from the beginning when we see problematic or challenging behaviors, but really making sure that all of those components are in place so that we're only applying the most intensive interventions to those kids that really need it. And what the pyramid model does, which was initially developed for classrooms and since then has been delivered in a much broader range of services and programs where kids and families are in this birth to 5 age period, is really not deliver a specific curriculum or a specific intervention set, but really have an overlay to really offer a paradigm shift in the way that we traditionally have approached problematic behavior or mental health in young kids. And before it was very, focused on skills for development. It was very focused on reacting to challenging behaviors once they occur, and that this idea of not really thinking about mental health for kids if they were quiet or compliant in the classroom or in the home setting. And the pyramid model really gives a foundation for, at first, understanding the meaning and predicting challenging behavior, and that's really 9/10 of the work. And how do we support, any adults in the room with young kids to think openly when they see problematic behavior about what could the roots of this behavior be, and what are some proactive strategies that all kids and families need around, discussion and development of healthy social and emotional literacy skills. And then, what are some best practices that cut across a range of interventions that we can apply depending on the setting or presentation of the child when we're thinking about specific interventions for target children. So some of you may know, but the National Pyramid Model recently got funded to have a National Technical Assistance Center called NCPMI, or the National Center for Pyramid Model Implementation. It's funded by the Office of Special Education Programs, and it's really designed to help improve the capacity of states around the country in implementing the pyramid model, really in effort to improve social emotional functioning in our young systems.
And so our colleagues in the Birth to 5 office at MSDE have been engaging in ongoing technical assistance, and Kate and I have also been engaging in ongoing technical assistance with the National Pyramid Consortium, which is a partner of NCPMI.
Yeah, we're actually, on the ground level, really excited about this new initiative because they're beginning to roll out a lot of new and more innovative supports for implementation in a range of settings for the model.
So one of the foundations of National Pyramid Model is making data-informed decisions in terms of implementation. So it might not seem like a data-driven model. It seems warm and fuzzy about how to work with families, but it's really about how do you use the data that you have around what is working and what is not to make decisions around where to target improvements and come up with action plans. So that runs all the way from an itty-bitty kid in a home or a classroom or a program-wide all the way up to the state. And so we'll talk a little bit about what that looks like. But state leadership teams are encouraged across the country to use data-based decision-making when they're examining their statewide implementation components and outcomes for local programs, practitioners, and children. And in our state implementation teams, our SIT teams, we actually have been doing this on an ongoing basis for a little while. So at the program level, we're going to talk more in this webinar about how to use the data, how to ask questions that inform data-based decision-making in terms of your implementation.
And within the pyramid model, there's actually multiple sources of fidelity and data assessment tools, which are really helpful. I think, as Margot was saying on the previous slide, many components with respect to, if it's parents or classroom teachers or early intervention providers or programs talking about challenging behaviors, they often talk in sort of all good or all bad statements, and it's hard to know kind of when to intervene, either at the programmatic level or at the child level, or what success looks like, how you know when you're moving the needle towards less problematic behavior. And so there's opportunities to assess data and assess fidelity to the model in a range of ways that the National Pyramid Model folks have developed for us. So there's classroom observation measures. There's the teapot for preschool classrooms and the tippy toes for infant toddler classrooms. There's the self-assessment inventory of practices for classroom teachers, and the NCPMI team is soon to release a compendium one for early intervention providers, and that's really looking at, in your own interactions, how would you rate yourself with respect to these components that support pyramid model approaches to families. And then there's the benchmarks of quality measures. As Marco said, there's one for statewide leadership. There's another that looks at classrooms for early childhood, and there's another that looks specifically at Part C early intervention work. And we're going to be focusing on those two today, which is why they're highlighted here.
So the early intervention program, benchmark of quality, BOQ, really focuses in two ways. So one is focused on Part C, and like Kate said, one is focused on sort of 0 to 5 classroom-based program-wide. So this is just a visual of what the Part C1 looks like. You will see in the background it says draft, because at the national level they're still finalizing it, but they have given Maryland permission to start using it. And so you will have your local teams will be given copies of this for your distribution to accompany this webinar. So here's an example of what it looks like. You'll see the first topic is leadership team, and there are several topics that we're going to go over. For the purpose of this slide right now, you should be focused on the right side where it says not in place, partially in place, or in place. And so really, it's not a complicated way to collect data. You're going to talk with your teams and look at the questions and say, is this something we're doing fully? Is this something we started but it's not fully in place, or something we haven't even started, or we're thinking about starting but it's not really fully in place yet? So it's really all, some, or none. And this is just an example of the program-wide benchmarks of quality, and you'll see that it also starts with establishing your leadership team. So we're going to walk you through the different sections and where they're discussed in detail, sort of where they're the same and where they're different.
And just to clarify that even though it's called Early Childhood Program, that's the language that but the National Pyramid Model folks use, they mean programs that have classrooms.
Yeah.
So the, this previous slide, this is for the Part C early intervention work, and then this, no matter where it's happening, and then this is for programs that have classrooms for kids birth through 5. And there's, more similarities than differences between the two benchmarks of quality because, they're really hanging their hat on, what are the components of the pyramid model and how do you implement those. And they have many of the same critical elements. So looking at leadership buy-in, staff buy-in, family engagement components, what are program-wide expectations for staff when they're interacting with kids and families, and what are professional development opportunities or plans for staff, or how do you support staff to step into this role, procedures for responding to challenging behavior, and how do you monitor outcomes in Fidelity.
So we thought it would be best not to review every single item because you have them in front of you, but to really be thoughtful about what are the considerations when completing a program-wide benchmarks of quality. And for some programs, this may be new to you, or this may be something you've done before related to other kinds of implementation. But the things to really think about is you're doing this as a team, and so who is at that table? Who from your organization? Is it your director? Is it your director of training? Do you have representatives from every discipline? Do you have teachers at the table? It depends on the setting that you're working on, but to be really thoughtful that you're representing all of the important people who will be responsible for implementation.
And often, our experience at a couple of different tables when this is being discussed is that it really is an opportunity to kind of debate and bring data, so that this should be a pretty hefty discussion really at some points, and when you're saying yes, that it's in place, it's not this one agency, does one component, one staff member, or one sort of subgroup of our team do this, but does everybody do this for every case? And so it really gives you the opportunity to kind of take a look at where their practices are, and it's best to have some notes that help you once your team has a collective response to a given question, just document why you landed there, because the intention of this is to get a baseline of where you are now, but then also use it throughout a CQI process to continue to reassess. And so it's good to know why you were in one column or another for a given question, so that as you grow and as you sort of move further in implementation, you can know, all right, we've satisfied that source of of saying no or partial.
It's good to also think about how are you making your decisions. So is that something one person at the table takes the lead on because they have supervisory experience, versus are you coming to this over consensus from many different people at the table? And there are many different ways that groups can come to decisions, but probably something you all want to be in agreement on and aware of as you're walking through. Is this something you say it has to be 100% in place, versus 80% is okay to count it as a 2? And then how are you going to use this for planning your implementation process? So the intention isn't to do it at the beginning of the year and turn it in so you say you did it, but it's really to use it as a launching point to say, oh, now we have a plan. We have some places to engage in CQI. We have some targets and an action plan. And it's really meant to be done at least twice a year, ideally 3 times a year. So, beginning of the year, middle of the year, end of the year, if your program allows.
And, how are these results being disseminated? So, really wanting to be able to use this as a way to make the data transparent to your entire team, because the work is going to be transparent to them, right? You're going to be asking them to do, new screeners or new strategies with families or sort of new assessment points. And so having them kind of really understand the why in that is often really helpful. And it is consistent with the model. That's what we would ask, programs to do for families that are receiving, a treatment plan or co-signing to work. So we want to make sure that you're doing that with your teams as well.
First section is the leadership section, and you'll see that these first 3 questions are identical for both the classroom and the Part C. So it's really thinking about, does your team have broad representation for administrators, interventionists, parents, teachers? The language is slightly different on the classroom form, but it still gets at wide representation of specialists and personnel across levels. And then, do you have administrative support? I think all of the national experts would say it's very difficult to effectively implement the pyramid model without strong administrative support. So for us, we feel like we have very strong administrative support at the state level, which makes our job a lot easier, and that should trickle down to program levels having administrative support, and then down to the classroom level or the interventionist level in the home. So our administrators attending meetings and trainings and connecting with the team and things like that.
And you can see, like, question 2 here is a really good example of how many of the benchmarks of quality questions really help unpack what they mean by that. So you could say, yeah, we have support by the administrators because they, paid for this training or whatever it might be. But are they actually attending the meetings and trainings about implementation? Are they really connecting with the team about resources and other initiatives? Is there visible support of implementation in the pyramid model? Are they ensuring that budgets and professional development opportunities remain available as a result of high fidelity implementation? So it really, the national pyramid folks help inform what they mean by those things, which is, I think, helpful in terms of really rating where you are with implementation.
And then you should have, at the local level, leadership teams that have a regular meeting, right? That they should be happening at least once a month for a minimum of an hour, and that you've attended such fairly consistent, so not one member who comes every 3 or 4 months. And that you have established ground rules and other logistics that make those meetings effective. And again, this is a really good opportunity to always be looking at your benchmarks of quality. So you do it as a baseline in the beginning of the year, and then you have your monthly meetings where you're really talking through where do we want to prioritize efforts, budget, time, supervision, coaching, all of those things.
The next page just delineates where Part C and classroom benchmarks of quality differ in leadership, and you can see it's varied only slightly. So actually question 6 is the same, which is why we didn't repeat it in the second column. But here it looks a little bit, the language is a bit different. And the classroom one gets into a little bit of child discipline because that's going to be happening within the classroom setting.
And for some reason, the classroom one talks about team reviews and revises the plan at least annually. That doesn't exist in Part C, although I think it's implied that you're revisiting it periodically, annually at a minimum.
The next subsection looks at staff buy-in, which we know is a key component to the success of any implementation. And again, there's some different language here. The first column looking at Part C, the second column looking at classrooms. And I mean, overall, it's really, what is done to support the staff to be aware of the initiatives, to sort of understand and unpack the components of the initiatives, and to build their skills in addressing social emotional needs for young kids.
Right. So they both reflect the importance of addressing social emotional, but it gets at how your programs are functioning differently. So program-wide, family engagement is really important throughout the pyramid model. So Part C and classroom-wide differ a little bit in how they discuss it. So Part C really talks, it's different because you're primarily home-based, and so there's a lot more opportunities for families to be informed of the goals. In an IFSP, you could actually have social emotional competence goals, or at least be providing feedback on challenging behavior or promoting pro-social behavior in an ongoing practice directly with the parent, during home visits. And so that can, happen narratively, through conversation, through books, notebooks that go back and forth between providers. But there's a special emphasis in Part C about making sure you identify family priorities, resources, and their concerns, and what their priorities are, and how you tailor the social emotional goals to meet the needs of the families. This is generally consistent with the principles of an IFSP.
So this next slide looks specifically at how the classroom-wide BOQ looks at family engagement. And again, it's slightly different just because of the nature of the opportunity to interact with families. But again, really looks at first sort of seeking out family input to make decisions or to support the plan around decision-making for individual needs for kids that have challenging or concerning behaviors in the classroom. So, what would specific strategies for that specific child be based on their knowledge of their own child? And, are there multiple mechanisms to share program-wide plans with families and mechanisms really meaning avenues or venues to communicate with families and get their buy-in and input so that it's not just one-directional communication, but really, how do we involve and initiate support through a variety of mechanisms and translate what's happening in the classroom to the home. So both, asking them initially when there's concerning behavior about what's working well in the home and how can we bring that in, and then if something's working well in the classroom, how do we really proactively and intentionally help translate that to the home setting as well. And then, are families involved in planning in a proactive way? Really the core of what classrooms are doing.
So this is where the Part C and the classroom differ a little. So the next section in Part C is building staff capacity. And so really that looks at how are you preparing your staff to have the ability to promote, to prompt parents to promote social emotional skills. So a plan should be in place for ongoing professional development and practice-based coaching for use in the pyramid model. And we do know, at least for the SEFEL counties, that is in place and is happening, and it's beginning to happen in many other jurisdictions. And it should be culturally responsive and evidence-based, which as the national pyramid model dictates, it generally is. It's very focused on practice-based coaching. Each jurisdiction should really have practitioner coaches identified and trained in these coaching practices and be engaging in sort of reflective practice with the rest of the providers who can then, trickle that down to parents on sort of what are the needed supports, how do you promote this, how do we help families. And it happens in a variety of ways, but should always be happening sort of collaboratively. And that there should be a process for training new, like onboarding new practitioners and coaches as we have staff changes, so that there should just be a program in place for that and thought dedicated to that. And that, that professional development and coaching includes, support for children and families who have complex needs. So we can't just be focused on building professional skills without thinking about the needs of the families and making sure that we're specifically addressing the needs of the families that you work with.
And in many cases in Part C, that sort of bleeds into the sort of realm of parent capacity and parent well-being and supporting your teams to understand the sort of high linkage between child outcomes and parent outcomes at this age and just the importance and comfort with addressing those things all in service of the child. This next slide looks at, the next section in the Birth to 5 program-wide classroom BOQ, which again, this is where there's some delineation from the Part C benchmarks of quality, and this is looking at program-wide expectations. Really, this is expectations for classroom staff. So this is looking at, 2 to 5 positively stated program-wide expectations are developed. Helping programs develop their own expectations collectively in a positively stated way. Again, there's often many parallels when we're thinking about applying pyramid model implementation to what we ask of kids and families. And so the idea of stating things positively is important here when you're looking at staff buy-in and engagement. The expectations are written in a way that applies to both children and staff. When expectations are discussed, the application of expectations to program staff and children is acknowledged. And again, that's how you would apply Principle C on kids, right? That they're aware of what the rules are and that they're reinforced when they're meeting them. And that they're developmentally appropriate and linked to concrete rules for behavior. Program staff and families are involved in the identification of expectations that address the needs, cultural norms, and values of programs and communities. So really honoring the fact that these would look different in different settings and be sort of authored by all parties and not just leadership. That expectations are shared with families and that, so that there's transparency in what those expectations are, and that they're posted regularly, and that there's strategies to acknowledge children's use of expectations and what might have to be sort of scaffolded to support them when needed. And pyramid model often will talk about the idea of, training everybody in the building and not just the classroom teachers.
Right.
And, often it might sound sort of piecemeal or sort of a throwaway to say like bus drivers and kitchen staff, but those are often folks that are intervening with kids when problematic or concerning behavior is happening. I think we can all recall the first or second time that we were in a lunchroom when there was more than one classroom eating, and it's incredibly sort of loud and overwhelming. And so those are often places that might be much more sensitive for kids to illustrate concerning behaviors or need some more support.
And I think that much like you might have program-wide expectations for consistent curriculum around reading, math, those kinds of cognitive skills, things like that, it's really having program-wide expectations on how do you support and promote social emotional learning, that everyone's on the same page. This is a priority, but that the strategies are roughly the same. And then the classroom version also has a second section called professional development and staff support, which is much the same as the prior section was for Part C, but again, a plan for providing ongoing professional support, training, coaching for the classroom in the pyramid model. Statewide, there are several localities that are engaging in pretty targeted classroom-based coaching with cycles of practice-based coaching, and that's really designed to help staff identify action plans on how to improve their implementation of the pyramid model.
Yeah, and I think, it's important when we're thinking about practice-based coaching or reflective coaching within pyramid model implementation, it's really not intended to be consultation about specific kids. You can often use examples of specific kids to support, the teacher or practitioner's growth in application of the model, but that it's really designed to help that practitioner or help that teacher grow their skills and efficacy in addressing problematic or concerning behaviors across the board. And as you can see here, they intentionally highlight the idea of these trainings being culturally responsive and addressing the sort of huge, component of implicit bias in early childhood and behavior responses.
So now we get back in sync a little bit. So Part C, the next section is providing interventions to children with persistent challenging behaviors. And this is sort of really the nuts and bolts of what we're trying to do, is that as we all know, Part C, interventionists didn't necessarily go to school for teaching parents how to deal with challenging behavior, but it comes up in the work that we do every day. And so what is in place to help practitioners learn how to support parents and caregivers in responding to children, that there should be individuals or an individual at least with behavioral expertise, and that person is on staff to guide staff and families when higher level needs are identified, and maybe funneling kids to more intensive programs as needed, and that there are program procedures for a functional behavioral assessment to help identify and help work with families on what is the sort of impetus of these problems, what are triggers, what helps children. Practitioners are coached on how to work with do a functional behavioral plan with families in the homes or child care centers if that's where services are delivered.
And this is where a lot of the work is, right? It's not just how do you on paper document, what the theory of the behavior is, but how do you really coach that resistant or avoidant parent to implement what's going on? And so much of that is around managing expectations of behavior change and sort of championing some slight movement of the needle in one direction or another, and really using that tool as a strategy to in a very very explicit way track and monitor the behavior change.
Right. And again, this is, you want to be thinking about, are we doing this? Are we doing this a little bit? Are we not doing this at all? So that those answers are different for different jurisdictions, and somebody who says partially in one county may be partial for a very different reason than another county. So this is where, if you think back to some of the earlier slides, right, documenting what it is that's in place versus what's not in place, and then how do you identify your action plan from there? And then the classroom benchmark of quality component, which is comparable, is really just called procedures for responding to challenging behavior. And you can see from the picture, it's really more classroom-based challenging behaviors. And so that you're thinking more of a traditional classroom setting. The teachers, have teachers receive training related to potential biases when responding to behavior in the classroom. Implicit bias is a big thing right now. There is a lot of current training available, and at least conversations with staff around how that might be playing out for you guys locally. Our program staff responsive to children's behavior problems approach appropriately using evidence-based approaches that are positive, sensitive to family values, cultural and home language, and really providing guidance for positive behaviors versus responding to negative behaviors. Because the whole point is, how are we supporting kids to be positive versus just reacting and punishing negative? Is there a process in place for responding to crisis situations? And many programs have a written response, a protocol for when a really high-level crisis comes up. And can you identify in your building or in your center at least two ways, ways to request assistance when needed? So there should be a sort of written plan that everybody knows, because many centers have a written plan that as you have staff change, sometimes it's not updated or distributed or current or known to your staff. And then the teachers have the opportunity to problem solve with colleagues and families around this problem behavior. So having that time to reflect and gain support through the formal coaching process, but also just through your peer support, mentoring, and family sessions is really important.
There's a couple more components to this section that we put in a second slide just for the sake of everyone's eyesight. And that looks at team-based processes for individualized interventions with children with persistent challenging behavior. So essentially really the principle that any child that's at the top of the pyramid that's really already has the relationships and the environment and the sort of proactive teaching around these things in place, but still needs some significant supports, that those discussions should happen with a range of disciplines and perspectives at the table. That's not just on the teacher who's been through a training to implement, and that often those are the kids that need somebody to look at development, somebody to look at the family component, somebody to look at sensory needs, somebody to look at behavior needs, and that's really when the team time happens. And that it's not just one discussion, but tracking it over a period of time. That an individual or individuals with behavioral expertise are identified to not only coach staff, but to support that family and child directly. And that strategies for partnering with families when there is a problem have been identified and are, as Margot said on the previous slide, are known to staff, so that there's a clear pathway to how to bring up and how to address concerning behaviors with families. And much of that is really around engaging families on positive things as well. So the first thing that they're hearing from you is not because something went bad, but what is the protocol for for reaching out to families and for planning with them.
And then the last section is monitoring implementation and outcomes, which some people might think of as the most boring section, but it's actually probably the most vital in order for you guys to feel confident and demonstrate that you're making the progress you intend to make. And so you can see the sort of side-by-side for Part C and classroom is that they're fairly similar, and the idea is that you are collecting data summarized as visual displays and reviewed by the leadership team on a regular basis. So there is actually, there are some accompanying Excel spreadsheets where you can enter this data and it'll visualize it for you, and we should be able to push those out statewide in the upcoming months. The program is really supporting regular social emotional screening. We haven't talked about this a lot, but certainly when Kate goes around the state coaching for Part C, it's a big point of conversation, because how are you identifying kids who have social emotional concerns? And so universal screening in your programs is one really good way to make sure you're catching all the kids that may be struggling, even if that's not the reason they showed up in your program. The program measures that you're using implementation fidelity, so practice checklist. So that is the benchmarks of quality, and then Kate mentioned the the inventory of practices, which again is coming. It's forthcoming in the upcoming months. It's being updated at the national level right now. But that really allows individual providers to just do a checklist of, am I doing this, am I doing this? It's a sort of a self-check. And that program monitors the family's use of effective practices and specific intervention plans. So again, this is how well are you engaging families. If they're at the table and they're engaged in the conversation, you should be able to have some evidence that they are or are not implementing your mutually just agreed upon plan. And then,
yeah, so for the classroom, you can see the numbers are a little bit later because that VO2 is a little bit longer. But looking at data that are collected, summarized, and visually displayed again, and I think the point of that is really how do we make the data useful, right? So often long reports are not highly read, right? And so, but you can really quickly see growth or movement or the need for attention if a number is really off from other ones. So the visual displays are a way to kind of make the data accessible and reviewed by leadership team on a regular basis. So how do we, not just use this as baseline, but continually assess the data to inform practice. But the program leadership monitors implementation fidelity of the components of program-wide implementation and uses data for decision-making around goals. And that those goals should be adaptive and change based on what the data is telling you. That the program measures implementation fidelity and the use of pyramid model practices by classroom teachers as well. So not just program-wide, but at the teacher level to really understand what professional development and coaching supports are needed, are useful, are making big changes and strides, all of those things. And that the program will also collect data on behavior incidences. So, often when there's discussions at the national level around pyramid model practices, people will talk about staff buy-in, people will talk about sort of family engagement. The most meaningful data that always seems to move the needle, especially with respect to sort of funding and sort of very high-level administrators, is when you talk about child-level data. And so that's why they're really tying here this idea of, can we tie the number of behavior incidents and program actions to implementation of pyramid model and say that attending to these baseline pyramid structures is really helping reduce the number of incidences for challenging behavior. That number 39 looks at behavior incident and monthly program action data are being analyzed on a regular basis. So not just when the end of year report is due, but really sort of how does the team sit with that regularly? To look at, are there any potential issues related to disciplinary action bias or are there any trends that we're seeing that could be addressed in some way proactively? And then pulling back again at sort of program level data summarized and shared with program staff and families on a regular basis, which is a consistency for Part C as well. So how do we again sort of use this data, this assessment data, not just at this leadership sort of deep level thinking space for monthly leadership team discussions, but how do we make that available to program staff in both Part C in classrooms and to families engaged in the work? And the final is looking at data being used in an ongoing monitoring problem solving, which is sort of just a summary for what we've said throughout this whole slide.
Yeah. So I think there's some big takeaways. It's a lot of information in a short period of time. It can seem like a lot, but I think the big thing is that you really want to be looking at your practices that are contributing to supporting the pyramid model implementation, and really that's in service of promoting social emotional well-being of families, which makes your job easier actually. So the intention of sitting down and going through either of these what seems like a long document is to unpack each of those components that are fundamental to implementation of the pyramid model.
And I think often it really helps programs see what they're already doing, So, but a lot of these things, like when we think about staff buy-in, you think, sure, staff know about it, but what are the components that the pyramid model is really thinking of when they're thinking of those things? So it both lets you know what you're doing. It also gives you some really clear, sort of light list ideas about what you could do, and that it really naturally initiates a CQI process for your program. As we discussed in the last slide, this idea of really intentionally using and sharing data regularly with a range of parties to make sure that there's ideas about what's making sure that we're getting the right data and that we're what are some new ways or new course corrections that we can make to be aligned or realign with pyramid model practices. It also gives you a baseline to monitor improvement and make decisions about where to focus your growth. So there's going to be a lot of components that you might not be in place yet, and so you can have some discussions about do we want to go with focusing on these two components of 6 and 7 of establishing a leadership team, because then that will help support the rest of it, or is there some other decision that we're making? And so it really helps your teams have a clear sort of focus as to why they're biting off the next bite of the apple, so to speak. And that it supports program-wide access to database decision-making. So this idea of really being transparent and clear with staff about sort of the assessment of where we are collectively, because they're the ones that are going to be asked to implement all the changes. If you have any questions at any time about any of this, both of our emails are on here, and we're open to discussing either at large sort of the documents that we discussed, or as you're sort of wrestling and wrangling in your leadership teams about where you would fall with a given answer, or what the best next steps would be once you've completed them. We're happy to discuss.
Yes, absolutely.
So thanks for your time.
Thanks for listening.